Hey everyone, in this video we're going to take a look at chapter 40 from book 5 of Caesar's de Bello Gallico. So remember, we're in 54 BC at this point in the middle of the Gallic Wars. We've seen Ambiorix has already attacked the fort of Sabinus and Cauda, which we have highlighted here, the land of the Eburones, and after they wipe out Sabinus and Cauda, they've turned their attention towards the camp of Cicero. Now, Ambiorix has gone out at this point, he's sent messengers, and he's tried to rally all the neighboring Gauls like the Nervii and told them, hey look, I already wiped out a Roman legion, we can attack everyone and just keep doing this same trick. So at this point, they've arrived at the winter quarters, the fort of Cicero, and we're going to see what happens as they begin the battle. Now, one thing I want you to think about as you read through this is you want to compare it to what happened with Sabinus and Cauda, just because it is interesting to see the similarities and some of the differences on how the Romans react to what the Gauls are doing. So before we dive too far into it, the first thing I always tell you to do is make sure you know the vocab really well. So there's a bunch of good vocab lists out there. A lot of commentaries have them. Just find one that works for you. Quizlet has a million of them. You'll be fine. Practice the words just because it's so hard to understand what's going on if you just don't know what the words mean. So start there, read the words. And then the other thing that you want to do is make sure you read this aloud. I know I always say this, but in Caesar, a lot of times it's the AP curriculum, and my AP students don't have a lot of time and they feel pressured. But reading the story aloud brings it to life. It lets you work on your speaking, your pronunciation. You could have a classmate read it back to you so you can work on your listening skills. This is really where you get into more like reading comprehension and understanding and not just translating in your head. It's meant to be a spoken language. Take a few minutes, just bring it to life. It's always good to do that. The other thing I'd encourage you to do is do the read and reread method, right? So I say this all the time. You would read through the entire chapter, start to finish, write down any problem areas that you have, right, as you translate. So if there's anything you don't understand, write it down. When you're at the end of the chapter and you finished your first read, go back and look at your list and try to figure out where you went wrong. This is where commentaries will help. The one that we use a lot in my classroom is the one from Jeffrey Stedman, which is excellent. You can find it for free online on his website, but there's a bunch of other ones you could find too, and they'll help you through, right? Sometimes the idioms and the grammar can be tricky, and you might need some help to unpack it. Use everything at your disposal. And then once you've done that, repeat that process, right? Again, I know time is limited, but this is where it can really lock into your long-term memory and not just short-term. You want to make sure that you really understand what's happening. So when you repeat the process, your list should get shorter and shorter until you're eventually able to read through this chapter, start to finish, and you don't have any trouble at all, right? And you understand most, if not all of it. Again, I know your time is limited. That's tricky on an AP curriculum, but it's so worth it when the time comes from the test. You don't want to forget everything you did. Okay, so if you haven't done all that, pause the video, go back and do it. Otherwise, we're going to read through right now. We'll work our way through in small chunks, and we'll see what this chapter is all about. Okay, so the chapter starts like this. You have mituntor ad Caesarem confestim ab Cicerone literae magnis propositis primis, si pertulicent. Obsessis omnibus vis misi intercipiuntur. Okay, so it's starting with letters, right? So literae is really the word you're looking at here. The letters, they are sent, mituntor, right? So letters are sent to Caesar immediately by Cicero. So Cicero realizes we're in trouble here, right? There's a lot of Gauls, and he immediately says, I need help from Caesar. This is interesting. Again, I told you to compare. This is not what Sabinus and Cauda do, right? They actually entertain Ambiorix and they're kind of confused. Cicero is immediately kind of suspicious of what just happened here. They're being attacked. He's not going to wait to hear that the Gauls. He already thinks this is a problem. And what does he do? He sends out these letters with great rewards, primes, right? So magnis primes, great rewards having been offered, proposites. Now, this is not, and I think some commentators will mention this, he's not offering a reward to Caesar. Sometimes my students get confused and think that Cicero is like bribing Caesar to come help him. No, not at all. The rewards are for the messengers, right? So it's saying, and that's where you have si pertulicent, right? If they had carried them through, meaning he's talking to messengers and he's saying, if you make it through, I'm going to give you huge rewards on the other side. That idea of the rewards is important because it kind of shows how desperate he thinks the situation is, and it just started, right? So he's not entirely sure they'll be able to get through. There's a ton of Gauls. He immediately recognizes we're in trouble. So again, the first kind of opening line here gives you a lot into the mindset of Cicero, comparing it to Sabinus and Cauda. So then you have obsessis omnibus vis. You have with all the roads, omnibus vis, right? All the paths, all the roads having been blocked, the misi. So misi here literally means like those having been sent, the sent ones, if you want to say. It's really the messengers. Those sent out, you could say. Intercipiuntur, they are intercepted. right? So it doesn't work. So he desperately sends out letters. They all get intercepted. So news is not making it to Caesar, which is a problem, right? Cicero doesn't know this, but his messengers are not getting through. So again, you have to visualize they're surrounded, there's desperation. He's offering all these rewards. Cicero knows that they're in trouble, but the Gauls have blocked all the roads, right? So none of these messengers are going to make it. Okay? Then we continue on to the next line. You have noctu ex materia quam munitionis causa comportaverant. Tures ad modum, and you have the CXX, right, 120, excitantor incredibili, there we go, celeritate, quae de esse operi videbantur perficiuntur, okay? So we start with noctu, at night, right? So at night, you have to go to the subject, which is tures here. So at night, tures, or towers, excitantor, are raised up, right? They're built incredibili celeritate, with incredible speed or swiftness, right? And they're built completely ad modum, and there's 120 of them. So Cicero is able to really turn. And again, this is another key point I would make. A Roman fort, in the terms of winter quarters, doesn't mean a fortress, right? So when they build these winter quarters, they're not necessarily building a castle to withstand a siege. That's not what it is. So that's why he has to build up the towers. You would have a rampart and you would have walls, but it's not really this battle formation necessarily. It's like a temporary thing, and they're planning to stay for the winter and leave, right? So that's why you have the towers being built, right? 120 are built, and they're built ex materia, from timber, right? That word material is really talking about like wood, right? And it's wood or material which comportaverant, which they had obtained for the sake of causa, for the sake of fortification, munitionis. There's your genitive. So it's made from this timber that they had specifically gone out and said, okay, we need stuff to fortify the camp, right? So they're not using like wood for burning a fire or anything like that, okay? Then you have quae de esse opere videbantur perficiuntur, right? So you have the things which they seemed, right, videbantur, seemed for the work to be lacking, they are completed, right? So it's saying that all these things that they had to do to make it work, to build the defenses, all of this gets completed in the night. And when he says this, it's kind of an an odd phrase to say the things which seem to be lacking for the work. Like that's literally what he's saying here. It's really getting at the idea that whatever was not ready, right, was incomplete, they completed. And that's why you have perficiuntur there at the end, right? So they complete all the stuff that needs to be done. So here we can see Caesar's praising the men, Cicero, right? They do this really fast, which is good. They have a very swift response. Then it continues. You have hostes postero die multo maioribus coactis copiis castra appugnant fossam complent rather. So you have the enemy, right, the hostes, on the following day, posterior die, right? So on the next day, the enemy, they besiege the fort, the castra, right? They besiege the fort, and you have a syndeton there, right? So you have to imply, and they complent fossum, they fill in the ditch, okay? Then you have multo maioribus coactis copiis, or the ablative absolute. So it's saying with a much greater force or troops having been collected. So multa maioribus is the much greater, and then you have the copiis coactis, right? So the enemy with much greater troops having been collected besiege the fort. So the idea is the next day they have even more Gauls who kind of poured in, and now they're going all in at the fort. So when it says they fill in the ditch, again, when you think of a Roman fort, there'd always be a ditch on the outside. And the reason you build a ditch is not necessarily to have people fall into it, although that would be kind of funny, and you could put spikes at the bottom. But if you imagine a wall, right, in a Roman fort made of wood, let's say your wall is 10 feet tall on ground level. If you build or dig a 10-foot deep ditch in front of it, now your wall is really 20 feet tall, if that makes sense. So digging down is sometimes easier than building up, especially when you don't have a lot of like wood or lumber to build up. You just dig a ditch. That's easy enough. So filling in the ditch is an important thing that always happens in a siege. The Gauls are trying to kind of literally level the playing field so they can get up the walls faster. Okay? But it shows you how many men they have. And the syndeton kind of gives this idea of like how fast it's happening, right? Caesar's trying to write in a way that makes you feel like this is, all all happening at once swiftly. They attack, they fill in the ditch. Then you have eadem ratione quapridie ab nostris resistitur. You have hac idem reliquis deinceps fit diebus. Okay, so eadem ratione means by the same method, right? So by the same method, quapridie, on which or in which the day before they had done, right? Resistitor, it is resisted by our men. Okay, so Caesar's saying here that the exact same thing happens, right? Just like on the day before, this attack gets resisted by the men, right? So again, it's saying in which manner the day before they had resisted, right? So our men resisted, or the attack is the attack is resisted by our men in the same manner in which they had resisted the day before. Is really what you're getting at there with the quapridie in the middle. Okay, then you have hoc idem, right? This same thing happens fit, right? It happened reliquis diebus on other days, or on the rest of the days, the other days. Deinceps means like in succession. So it's saying here, what Caesar's saying is this keeps happening over and over and over again, this same thing, hoc idem, right? It just keeps happening. And the idea is that it's sort of like Groundhog Day. It just keeps repeating. The Gauls keep attacking and the Romans keep resisting, right? They're doing a good job of fighting them off. Then you have the next line. You have nulla pars nocturni temporis ad laborem intermittitur. Non aegris, non vulneratis facultas quietis datur. So you have nulla pars, no part of the night, nocturni, of the time of the night, of nighttime, you might say. Intermittitur is interrupted for the labor, right? Ad laborem. So in other words, it's saying they're working basically like through the night, right? Is kind of the idea for the work, right? So it's saying, I guess you say literally no part of the nighttime for work is interrupted is probably a better way to do it. It's not saying it's interrupted for the work, but it's the part of the night for work is interrupted. So they're working through the night, just to repeat that, right? It's a little bit odd. But they just keep working through, right? Trying to fix everything. And then you have facultas quietis, right? So no opportunity, right? That's your subject there, non facultas, no opportunity of quiet or of rest, dator is given, and then it's given to two people, non aegris, non vulneratis, to the sick, the aegris, or to the wounded, the vulneratis. So they're not allowed to rest, right? It's so desperate that Caesar's saying they have to work too, right? You have a couple of dative indirect objects there. So it's saying nobody's allowed to rest. If you're sick, if you're wounded, if you're hurt, it doesn't matter. And again, he's saying this to really praise and highlight the amazing work that his soldiers are doing, right? They keep fighting through, they're resisting, they're fighting it off. And again, it kind of echoes when you compare it to Sabinus and Cotta. It shows the difference, right? They kind of give in, they're like, oh, what's going on? Let's have a peace talk. Cicero is not having that. He's just fighting, not having any peace talk. He knows there's a problem, and they're doing well, right? They're fighting off and staying in the fort, okay? Then you get to the next line. You have quaecumque ad proximi die appugnationem opus sunt, noctu comparantur. Multae praeustai sudes magnus moralium pilorum numerus instituitor, there we go, tures contabulantur, pinae loricaeque ex cratibus attexuntur. There we go, right? We'll get it right, I promise. So you have quaecumque, right? Whatsoever, right? So you have whatsoever sort of opus sunt, work is needed, right? Whatsoever is needed is kind of one day you could do it, right? Whatsoever is the work to be done, right? Is kind of another way to translate this. For the following day, ad proximi die, for the siege, right, is the idea. So it's saying whatsoever work is needed for the siege on the following day at night, noctu comparantur, is obtained, right? So these things are all obtained at night, whatever they need for the siege. Okay, you have multi praeustai sudes. So you have many stakes having been burned at the end, I think is how a lot of commentaries will do it. So if you're wondering what he means by stakes that are burned, he's talking about taking stakes and just getting them blackened on the end to toughen them up, harden them up, right? That's a very old technique to increase the sort of strength of the wood, of the stakes. You would burn them at the end a little bit, and now you have something really, really sharp and really hard that you can use to fight off the enemy. And additionally, you have Magnus Muralium Pilorum, right? A great wall of javelins, a great number rather of wall javelins, Muralium Pilorum. So wall javelins, I feel like they've mentioned this in different commentaries. I'm still not entirely sure what a wall javelin is. Maybe one of you could look it up. But I think in essence, it's like putting javelins on the side of the walls to keep people from climbing up. That's always the vision I got, is having javelins sticking out from the fort, kind of perpendicular. So if you try to climb up, you might get impaled, or if you try to put a ladder, you will. Someone put in the comments if you want to look it up, what exactly that is. But again, it's just defensive works, right? That gets put into place institutor, right? So they're putting everything kind of together. And then on top of that, you have tures contabulantur, right? Towers are sort of built up or built on top. They're adding more towers. And then you have pini, which are like the pinnacles, the battlements, right? And the loricae, the parapets, I think is kind of what commentaries will say. But again, the battlements, the parapets, however you want to do it, they are woven a texuntur. They're woven from cratibus, from wicker. Right, so they're taking wicker, which is like kind of like reeds, and they're weaving these defensive sort of battlements and shields and things like that. And the idea of why you would do this, by the way, if you're wondering, is to block arrows, right? So you put up these things, you can get them woven out of wicker, you stick them on top of the wall, and it's a way to protect yourself so you're not getting shot on the top of the wall. But in essence, no matter how you break this down, you can see that the Romans are working through the night, they're working really hard, and they're building up their fort. And again, they're building these sort of wooden towers. They're usually depicted as being kind of multi-storied. You can actually see one here in this reconstruction. You would build up towers. This happens to be a gate, but you do it around the wall too. And there's sort of a second story, right? So you can climb up. If you have siege equipment like a ballista or something like that, you could put it on top. You could also put men with bow and arrows, whatever it is. That's kind of the visual you want to get of the Romans building up their wooden fort and adding battlements and wooden wall javelins and the wicker parapets. Like, that's what they're doing. So they're fortifying their position, but you have to imagine at the exact same time they're doing this, they're also fighting off the Gauls, right? So it's kind of a double-edged sword. So the Romans would be exhausted, and Caesar is very clearly praising them and how hard they work. Then you get this last part. You have ipse cicero tum tenuissima valetudine esset, ne nocturnum quidem sibi tempus ad quietem relinquebat, ut ultro militum concursu ac vocibus sibi parcere cogeretur. Okay? So you have Cicero ipse, Cicero himself, so the leader of this fort, right, the legate himself. Although he was, so cum here you want to translate as although, right? It's probably the easiest way to do it. That concessive idea of a cum clause, going with esset, right, which is just imperfect subjunctive. So you'd say, although he was, right, again, talking about Cicero, although he was very weak in health, right? You might say so, or he was with very weak health. I guess you could do it, or in very weak health. So tenuissima valetudine is saying that Cicero is really like exhausted. He's not doing well. He hasn't rested. It's the ablative of quality is probably how you'd want to describe it. But he's not doing very well either, right? So he's really struggling. So although he's not doing great himself, right? It says relinquebat, right? You have to go down to he left, he relinquished, right? He left for himself, sibi, not even, ne quidem, right? Not even the nocturnum, the night time, the tempus nocturnum, right? For rest, ad quietem. So it's saying even though he's exhausted, Cicero is not resting. He's not sleeping, not even at nighttime. And again, this really shows you a different kind of Roman commander, particularly when you compare it against Sabinus. Cicero is just fighting, right? He's not giving up. He's going to keep going. He's not even resting, even though he's tired. This is all great stuff, and shows like how Caesar is praising Cicero as being what you're supposed to be doing, right, as a Roman commander, right? So he didn't leave any sort of rest. So that moreover, right, ultro, he was compelled, right, with the result that you might even say, right, all these things, but he's not resting. He's not even giving himself anything like that. And then you have this result clause of so that he was compelled, right, cogeretur, he was compelled to spare himself, right, sibi parcere, to give up some time for himself, basically, by the concursu ac vocibus, by the gathering and the voices militum of his soldiers. So in other words, he's working himself to death, protecting everyone, and he voluntarily has to kind of give himself some rest. So his soldiers, by gathering around him and raising their voices, are telling him, "You need to rest. You're tired. We'll be fine." Right? That just shows you how Cicero is putting the livelihood of his men above his own, right? His own well-being. So you really see him shining in this narrative. Okay, so that's it for chapter 40. Again, it's the Romans fighting, they're preparing, but I would say the narrative is really focused on two things: Cicero and his leadership, and the ability of the Roman soldiers and how amazing they can fight and work, and how organized that they are. But that also goes back to Cicero. So I'd say Cicero is really the star of the show here. Some things to think about, though, just as we close it out. You want to notice how the desperate situation the Romans are in right now. You can see it because of how Cicero is promising messengers that he'll give them rewards if they break through. We mentioned that before. That's an interesting line to me. Right off the bat, you know they're in trouble. Okay. The other thing that I find interesting is you can see the speed and the efficiency, right, of the engineers. The Roman army and their engineers are always amazing. Caesar's engineering skills are always on display in the Gallic Wars. They're really good engineers, and you can see it here, right? It's one of their trademarks. So how efficient they are, they're building fast, they're repairing things. This shows up a lot of other times, and it's one of kind of the hallmarks of the Roman army, particularly Caesar's army, and it serves them well down the line too. The other thing you can notice is that description of a Roman fort and how it's defended. You get a really great description of what a Roman fort would look like, how they build it up, how they defend it, and this is why we know so much about it. I mean, not the only reason, but it's a really good glimpse into Roman forts if you're into that. And we talked about how you have Cicero's leadership versus Sabinus and Cotta. It's very night and day. Cotta is probably a little closer in that sense to Cicero, but Cicero's decisive. He makes the decision. He sticks with it. He's leading the men. He has a lot of qualities that, in particular, Sabinus really doesn't, and Caesar really highlights that. Okay. And I wrote in the next note, this is on purpose, right? Those three commanders all being compared to each other is the point. Caesar's definitely trying to show that Cicero is the one you're supposed to be, okay? And it should have you asking a question, why didn't Sabinus and Cotta do this, right? There is an interesting question to say, like, why didn't they just organize and fight? And that was the problem. They couldn't agree, right? One wants to go, one wants to stay, and it makes you wonder if they had stayed, right, as Cotta wanted to do, would they have survived? I mean, Cicero is showing that you can survive if you do this, but we'll never know because they don't do it. Okay. The other thing is, do you think one commander or two is more effective in a desperate situation? That's another thing to highlight. In the first attack, you had Sabinus and Cotta as equals, not figuring it out. Here you have just Cicero, and he's doing all the work. It speaks a lot to the Roman mentality, and I like to compare this to my students of why they have two consuls, right? When you have two people in charge, things really don't get done. You see this a lot through Roman history. If you're into the series I did on Hannibal, you saw this when you had Varro, right? And you have trying to fight Hannibal, and the two commanders or the two consuls are basically doing different things with the army on different day. That's kind of what's happening here too. It really does show that one person, good or bad, is more effective at making decisions, and this is why Romans have dictators down the line, right? The last thing I'd tell you to think about, the speed of the narrative. It really matches the the speed and the intensity of the attack and the resistance. So if you read through this, Caesar's writing kind of a very fast and direct narrative. There's not a lot of roundabout language. He's skipping over words like et, right, the asyndeton. It all leads to a speedy chapter, and I think that really mimics and adds the idea of like the desperation of the resistance, the speed of the Gallic attack. It's all kind of on display here, and it makes it a really fun chapter. It's not so much advancing the plot necessarily, but I would say it's an important one to know about just because it's showing you Cicero as compared to, again, Sabinus and Cotta. So hopefully that all made sense. If there's anything that you need explained, or I went too fast or skipped, or whatever it might be, just put it in the comments below. I'm always happy to help. But otherwise, keep at it. Hopefully it made some sense to you. And if not, just keep reading it and rereading it and trying to repeat it. But the goal is you want to get to a point where you can read through this start to finish and you don't have that many problems. That's how you know that you're in a really good spot and you're ready to move on. Good luck.